All right, everybody, welcome back. We are continuing on to starting to look at the eukaryotic side of, of life on Earth. And we're going to start off looking specifically at plants. So I wanted to start off today with, rather than necessarily a scientific article, I wanted to talk about environmental activism that's happening around seeds, both here in Philly and across the U.S. So an organization that's really awesome is called Native Seed Search, and they are working to preserve the biodiversity of native seeds throughout the U.S. And specifically working with indigenous groups to preserve and harvest specific seed cultures and to create them and to germinate them and to save seeds. And interestingly, they've worked with lots of different indigenous groups, and they've collected several seeds that are now being stored in the seed bank in Antarctica. A little bit closer to home in Philly, there's this fantastic organization called True Love Seeds, and they're working specifically with urban farmers throughout the Philadelphia area. And interestingly, they're working specifically to save seeds and heritage for seeds that were preserved throughout the African diaspora. So they're a fantastic organization that, again, is really looking to preserve the biodiversity of plants and farming culture um, and botany for diverse peoples. So I encourage you to go check out their links. I put a page up in your reading notes that have a couple articles about these two organizations and their ongoing work with plants. So again, science is a little bit more than than just study after study after study. They also are terms of looking at it in terms of environmental justice. So, starting off thinking about plants this lecture is we're going to be again really understanding how plant life is defined in the tree of life and what influences their diversity. And then we're going to really talk about how plants are structured and how they obtain their nutrients, and also how plants reproduce, respond to stimuli, and protect themselves. So this is really going to be again about understanding what makes plants unique in terms of the tree of life, and then specifically what those structures have to do with how plants grow and how plants thrive. So I wanted again to center us in the tree of life and understand where we're talking about. So previously we were talking about prokaryotic diversity, looking at bacteria and archaea, but now we're moving on to the domain that we're probably all more familiar with, and that is the domain eukarya. And specifically what we're going to be looking at first is plants in this structure. Now, within the plant clade, there are some very important distinctions that were made evolutionarily. So we have at the very beginning of these trees, we have what would be sort of like our common ancestor, where we're really starting to look at algae as our first common ancestor. But as we start to move up the clades, we start to get these important evolutionary advantages that then ultimately split into different clades. So initially we have bryophytes. So they're non-vascular. They can't move water throughout their bodies. And we're going to talk about why that's important in a little bit. And they're small plants living in dense environments. They're non-flowering, and their reproduction relies on water. So basically, in order for the male and female gametes to meet for these systems, water has to essentially carry the different spermatocytes to one another. As we move up to ferns. And now we're starting to get to vascular plants. So when we're talking about vascular plants, we're talking about plants that can successfully move water throughout their bodies. And ultimately, this is what informs what they look like. So you see that ferns are upright. They're still non-flowering, and their reproduction still relies on water. As we continue to go up, we have plants developing seeds. And once we have plants developing seeds, we have two main categories. We have gymnosperms and we have angiosperms. And ultimately, what those have to do with, and I put in another specific lecture that's going to look at the systematic differences between gymnosperms and angiosperms, but ultimately it has to do whether their seeds are exposed or are contained within in fruit or have flowers. So these are like the important clades that as we move up looking at different types of plant evolution. So when we're talking about the evolutionary advances of plants, there are really four big uh, changes that we need to consider. The first is the alteration of generations. So this is really talking about replication and how plants replicate. And we're going to go into this a little bit more specifically later on. But essentially, the sporophyte, the diploid multicellular stage, became the main generation of plants. The next big advancement was vascular tissue. So this is where we're talking about the development of the xylem and phloem, where water and nutrients can be processed and brought throughout the cell, throughout the plant cells. So this is really talking about internal structure, and again, like we talked about on the slide previous, this is really what gives plants their physical structure as well. The next big development, again, we sort of touched on this, was seeds. And this is where we're really able to provide nutrients and protection to that plant and embryo. And lastly, the last big evolutionary development is really the development of flowers and fruits. And that really improves mating success as well as seed dispersal. So again, thinking about a plant at a cellular level, what specifically makes a plant? And you've probably talked about this before in other biology classes, but it's worth talking a little bit, not just to sort of memorize what's here and what's absent, but to think about how they actually contribute to what a plant structurally functions as. So the first thing that is a big difference is these cell walls. And these cell walls provide a lot of structure to the plant. And then, secondly, we're talking about this very specialized organism, this organelle, chloroplasts, which this is what's chloroplast, which is, that's a typo there. Sorry, this should be chloroplasts, not chloroplates. Chloroplasts. Which are responsible for photosynthesis. And as I said, previously when we were talking about bacteria, initially this was likely a cyanobacteria that the cell essentially phagocytosed and employed it to be part of its working system. And lastly, we have this central vacuole, and this is a large organelle that enables the storage of water, and it ultimately sort of provides structure to plants and allows them to grow upright and gives them their rigidity. That rigidity, when these vacuoles are full, is called turgor pressure. So again, I want you to sort of think through, not just memorize, this is what makes a plant cell, but really think about how these specific changes really promote and create what a plant actually is and functions as. So we're going to continue from here so this was sort of a brief introduction to the evolution of plants, and we're going to be moving forward to understanding much more specifically the structure and function of plants. Okay, see you soon.